So what we want to do is we want to just work on these 3 or 4 verses tonight. There's really some neat things, but here's the thing we're going to do. We're going to work on Galatians 3, 6 through 9, blah, blah, blah. But what I really want to do is I want to introduce you to some other places in Scripture that reference these verses. This is what I think is fun. Frankly, anybody, there's nothing wrong with it, but anybody can take these verses and read them and read a commentary and try to understand them from different theological perspectives. But one of the things that I really am enjoying doing is saying, okay, here are these verses, but what about these verses over here? And so we're literally going to be looking at some verses tonight that actually appear to refer to the exact same verses in Genesis that Paul is referring to. And they appear to contradict what Paul is saying significantly. And so instead of reading these verses and saying, here's what they mean, and then reading the verses that contradict these verses and saying, well, this is what this means, we're going to try to reconcile the two, which I find to be rather fascinating and much more fun. So are we okay with that?
Sure.
Yep.
Yep. All right. So here we go. Let's get ourselves set up here, what's really going on. The Judaizers, the Jewish Christians, are absolutely obliterating Paul, arguing like crazy that what he's talking about is nuts. You can't you can't throw the idea of the law out the window just because Jesus came. The Mosaic law, the Mosaic covenant, was a conditional covenant that basically said, you have to do your part. God is saying, look, Israel, you have to do your part, and if you do your part, I'll do my part. And this, of course, was a very scary thing to the Jews. They knew they had to do their part. Paul comes along and says, no, that's not the case anymore. And so there's this big argument going on between the Judaizers, led and the Jewish Christian community, that quite frankly was led by James, the brother of Jesus, and by Peter down in Jerusalem. Paul is kind of stationed out of Antioch, and his mission is to the Gentiles. And so one of the things that Paul is doing is one of the things, hold on, we got a few more people we're going to bring into the fold here. Chris, did you make it on? Jeff?
Yes.
Oh, welcome, Jeff.
Hello.
Hey, Chris is here, but Chris has no microphone.
Oh, okay. Well, hello, Chris. Lisa will be very happy to hear that.
It's about time.
Yeah.
The tables are turned. So is Chris at your house, Brent?
No.
Oh.
Chris isn't at Brent's house. Okay. So, anyways, that's what we're going to do tonight. So here's what's happening. Basically, the Judaizers are saying, how in the world are we going to simply ignore this covenant with Moses? How can you possibly say, look at how many years the Mosaic law and the Mosaic covenant has been established. You can't throw out, 1,500 years of Jewish history, Paul. And that's the approximate time of Moses. Like, it was 1,500 years before Christ, most think. You can't throw that out. How are you going to argue that we can just throw this out? Well, one of the ways Paul could have argued was that he could have said, no, that was the old way, and the old way is now to be discounted. Well, Paul is a good enough theologian to know you can't discount old ways. There was a reason why old ways were old ways, and you have to be very careful as a theologian to just throw out entire ideas that have been orthodox over a long period of time. So what Paul does instead is he suggests that this concept that he's promoting, which is justification by faith, which then causes you to be righteous, actually stems from Abraham, who had a covenant with God 400 or 500 years before Moses. And so this is what Paul does, is he refers back to Abraham to say to these Judaizers, look, you might think that what you have on your side as an argument of antiquity is important, but what really is happening is that we have something even older than that to support what is really happening here with Jesus. Okay, so that's the setup. Verse 6 says, even so, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And so what Paul is doing here is he's quoting the Old Testament to show the Jews that their argument that Moses has been around forever and we need to follow Moses is actually usurped by a previous older covenant from Abraham. Abraham's covenant was unconditional. Moses' covenant was conditional. Okay, well, as what we'll do just like we do every week, we're going to go through this kind of verse by verse for a little while. And
Can you say that one more? I'm sorry, Derek. Can you say that one more time? Abraham's was unconditional and Moses's was conditional. Is that what you said?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to see this covenant here in verse 8. So what's happening here is in verse 6, even so Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. What Paul's saying is the belief is what caused him to be righteous, not the works of the law. And this goes clear back to Abraham. So I really like the way Luther in his commentary says this. Do you see how faith justifies without works? And then he goes on to say, sin lingers in us and God hates sin. A transfusion of righteousness, therefore, becomes vitally necessary. This transfusion of righteousness we obtain from Christ because we believe in him. This is how Luther looks at this verse, as a transfusion of righteousness. I really like that word, especially in light of the way we think of like a blood transfusion.
Right.
Yeah.
In modern medicine. Now, of course, a blood transfusion would have been something that I doubt Paul would have had any understanding of. But when you think about the language of a transfusion, it's pretty powerful. And I love the way kind of Luther explains this.
And what did he mean, Derek, when he said sin lingers? Was he talking about the presence of sin without the power of it, or where was he coming from?
Yeah. Well, Luther understood, like most theologians understand, that there really is, we don't stop sinning because we have been declared righteous. And so there is, so in some ways Luther talks about these two different types of sin, but we won't get into that tonight. However, what Luther is specifically talking about with this verse is sin lingers in us. The original, we're born into sin. Thus it lingers in us, and God hates that part, that he hates the sin that's in us that we're born with. A transfusion of righteousness, therefore, becomes vitally necessary. And so what I see Luther saying here is he's referring to the sin we're born with, the sin nature, the original sin that was given to us through our DNA from Adam.
Got it.
And so we need to be transfused. However, I just mentioned that concept of two different types of sin because if anybody's listening to this recording, yes, that exists and it's talked about later, but we're not going to talk about it tonight. Okay, so let me make sure I didn't miss anything here.
So you're saying that sin nature lingers, but original sin is what is eradicated when God's Spirit comes in our spirit.
No, what I was saying was our sin nature that we're born with is the original sin. And without belief, that cannot be eradicated. But belief takes that original nature that we're born with, and through in Luther's word, a transfusion of righteousness, the sin, imagine like you having a blood transfusion, and all the blood you have is tainted with a disease, just like it would be if you were getting a blood transfusion. It would be because you had a disease. And so imagine your blood having the disease of sin. And so a transfusion takes place where all the blood that's diseased in your body is taken out that you were born with, because you don't, the kind of diseases you get in your blood are like hereditary. Imagine it like that.
Right.
And so the blood that was tainted with the disease called sin comes out, and it's transfused with the blood that is now completely righteous. That's kind of how I viewed that language, and I really kind of like the metaphor or the picture of it. If anybody has any other questions, just speak up. Okay. So now I want to take you to another verse. We'll be coming right back here to Galatians, Romans 4:8-13. And what I want to make sure we're aware of is that this isn't the only time Paul discusses this concept. In Romans chapter 4, Paul says, "For we say, faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness." Okay? Now, this is kind of an interesting thing to think through, because one of the arguments, of course, from the Jews is going to be, yeah, but Abraham was circumcised. See, that's the whole point. The Jews are saying, no, you have to still be circumcised. That's the whole argument. You have to still follow the law, and circumcision was crucial in order, we've looked at that verse before in Exodus, where it says, if you are circumcised, then you are my people. Obviously, that's my paraphrase, but it's very important. But here, we're saying faith is credited to Abraham as righteousness. And the Jews are saying, yeah, but okay, that's not quite right, because Abraham was still circumcised, so you can't just go back to Abraham and say that his faith was credited him to righteousness, and these Gentiles shouldn't be circumcised, because Abraham was circumcised. So, here's what we have. We have Paul explaining, how then was it credited while he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but uncircumcised. Okay, what Paul is referring to, because Paul knew the Old Testament very well, what he knew is that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness before he got circumcised, which was crucial, again, to the argument. Calvin actually brings this up and references it in his commentary as he references back to Genesis 17:24. Look, now Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. All right? The age of Abraham was way older when he got circumcised, way beyond the time when his faith was credited to him as righteousness. And this is what Paul is referring to. Okay, was that Lisa, or who was that?
That was just kind of mean. He had to get circumcised when he was so old.
Yeah, I can't even imagine being 99 years old and getting circumcised. I have a hard time imagining it at any age, actually. In fact, when my son got circumcised, I immediately left the room. And I'm thinking, there's no possible way I'm going to hang around here.
I wish we were looking at these scriptures now. Think about little baby boys that get a break.
Okay, we are back. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Was that something that every good Jew would have known, and Paul was just reminding them of that? Or is that because he had higher learning and was taught that by Gamaliel or somebody, that Abraham was circumcised at that late age? Or does it matter?
Yeah, I don't know that it matters a whole lot. I think these Jews are human just like we are, and I can't imagine the Jewish people of the day not attempting to try to make Scripture fit into their own paradigm. We do it all the time.
Sure.
And so they were human for them to argue that, well, wait a second, Abraham was circumcised, and then of course Paul's going to argue back, yeah, but his faith has created him to righteousness. He was righteous before he was circumcised. The circumcision didn't make him righteous. Okay.
Yeah.
So this was a crucial was a crucial concept to them at the time. We're going to spend another 15 minutes or so talking about the details of these things, and then we're going to move right into the practical application, into the lives transforming practical application of how these actually fit into our daily lives. Okay, verse 7. Therefore, be sure that it was those who are, Therefore, be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham. The scripture, hold on one second. Okay, this is really kind of very important. I don't want to skip over this. I almost skipped over it. Therefore, be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham. Okay, many of you lately have ran across people who are universalists, okay? Which means that nobody goes to hell. We're all sons of Abraham. Would be one justification to this concept of universalism. Here we have a verse that is strongly opposed to the concept of universalism. Be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham, and those who are sons of Abraham are declared or have the blessing of Abraham, which is justification by faith. Now, this really came into, I think, just like we looked at Calvin just a minute ago to see this whole argument, I find both Calvin and Luther very entertaining. Calvin is going to be very entertaining from an intellectual perspective. Of course, Calvin's going to refer back to the intellectual argument that Abraham's age of 99 was past the age when he was declared righteous. Luther, though, talks about verse 7 like this. Ishmael and Isaac were both the natural children of Abraham. By rights, Ishmael should have enjoyed the prerogatives of the firstborn, if physical generation had any special value. Nevertheless, he was left out in the cold while Isaac was called. This goes to prove that the children of faith are the real children of Abraham. Again, the children of faith are the real children of Abraham. Just because, in fact, even one of his sons, who, if he's not believing, if he's not a believer, is not considered a son in the way, does not have the DNA of this blessing. And this was really important to Luther. And I think it was really, I think this is really important even today. I hadn't really ran across, it's hard to, even Rob Bell, what I heard the other day, and I don't know this for a fact, but even Rob Bell now is getting accused of universalism, which is nobody goes to hell, everybody goes to heaven, everybody's justified, everybody's righteous. And I don't even know if that's true, but it doesn't even matter. People are saying that about Rob Bell. And this is a verse that I think Luther does a really good job of explaining that, wait a second, just because you're a son of Abraham, because you're a son physically of Abraham, a descendant physically of Abraham, that's not really what makes you a son. What makes you a son is the faith. And we're going to see that again here shortly. In verse, and stop me if you have any questions on that. In verse 8, now we have the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed. Now, honestly, guys, one of the most basic... Go ahead.
I'm just saying, wow, preach the gospel beforehand to Abraham.
Yes. This is a very Protestant viewpoint and a very controversial concept with Jews and with Catholics. And so what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little time understanding this because it's really, really important. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. Verse 2, And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. Finally, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. This is the Abrahamic covenant. This is an unconditional covenant. There's nothing here that says, Abraham, I'm going to bless you if you do this, if you do that. There's no conditions to this covenant, to this contract that God has with Abraham. A contract can be unconditional. A contract can be conditional. This one is unconditional. There's three things that this Abrahamic covenant gives. In verse 1, it gives him land. Here you see it. Boom. In verse 2, he gives descendants. I will make you a great nation. Okay? And in verse 3, he gives, I will bless you, and in you, the families of the earth will be blessed. This is the precursor to redemption. You will be blessed. And the way Paul, the way Luther, the way Protestantism looks at this verse and this covenant, this contract, was a precursor to what was to come. Blessedness, redemption. That's why when Paul talks in verse 13, I think it's Galatians verse 13, let me grab it here. In verse 14, let's just go to it. Galatians verse 3:14. In order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham. Do you see what we just looked at in chapter Genesis 12:1-3? We just looked at the fact that God promised Abraham blessing and redemption. Paul is referring back to the Abrahamic covenant in Galatians chapter 3. So the blessing may come to Abraham, to the Gentiles, so that we would receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So you can start seeing how important this concept of Abraham is to the whole view of justification by faith, redemption, and grace of the New Testament. I'm going to stop there real quick. Any questions on that? Anybody find this at all interesting?
Yeah, I do. I find it fascinating.
Derek,
Now-
what did you say that Luther had said, children of faith, what? I can't remember what you said.
Yeah, what he's saying is he's just discussing verse 7. And notice here, to be sure, that, in other words, he's saying, don't be confused.
Okay, gotcha. That's
You are not a son of Abraham because you are a descendant of Abraham. You are a son of Abraham because of your faith. Your faith makes you a son of Abraham. Goes to prove that the children of faith are the real children of Abraham. Okay, then we talked about verse 8 with the Abrahamic covenant. The only other thing I want to mention is Calvin, as he talks about this particular verse, says, as to the word righteousness, we must attend to the phraseology of Moses when he says that, quote, he believed in the Lord and he counted it to him for righteousness. Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. He intimates that the person is now righteous who is reckoned as such in the sight of God. Now, this I have a problem with. But this is typical Calvin. Calvin is now trying to say that you are righteous in the sight of God. Why is he doing this? Calvin is concerned about two things: the sovereignty of God and the depravity of man. To give man any credit whatsoever for about anything is just very difficult for Calvin. Calvin thinks pretty much all man is totally wicked. So, it would make sense that we would say that this righteousness is in the, quote, sight of God. Now, this language, I really never realized, this language is all over Christianity. Oh, yeah, we're righteous in the sight of God. God thinks we're righteous. God is somehow, but we're really not righteous. And in some ways, you would make sense to have this kind of hint from Calvin that we're righteous in the sight of God, but we're not really righteous. We're still screwed up, depraved. We need all kinds of rules and discipline. And this is exactly how Calvin lived out his life. And when he was in Geneva and told to take over the theology of that city, the first thing he did was to say we are justified by faith, and then place so many rules on the city that they actually kicked him out because he couldn't stand all the rules that he had. He eventually brought him back. But the point is that Calvin is all about making sure that we do the right things the right way and all the discipline necessary. So it would make sense that Calvin would use this language. We're righteous in the sight of God. And this is language that has been put down through the years into our Christian understanding. Here's the thing, though. We are not righteous in the sight of God. God has not somehow deceived himself into believing that we're something that we're not. God is not delusional. God hasn't, missed the mark on this. The fact of the matter is, God has declared and imputed his righteousness in us. We've had a blood transfusion of his righteousness. And it's not just that God thinks we are, but we really aren't. It's that we really are. And it's something I think we need to be careful about as we're looking at different ways and different views of different theologians, and why you're going to hear different things from different people in different denominations.
So
Okay.
when people say things like, well, when God looks at me, he doesn't see me, he sees Jesus, or God looks at me, but Jesus and the cross are in front of me. I mean, stuff that somehow is indicating a message that who we actually are has to be hidden from God by Christ, versus his righteousness is actually in us. It's not that he sees Christ when he looks at us. He looks at us, and he sees us as righteous. Am I hearing you right?
Almost. Again, it's a slippery slope. You got to be very careful. I would say he sees us completely righteous because of Christ.
Okay.
All right. But he doesn't see Christ and then think we don't have righteousness. He's just conned himself into believing that we're righteous.
Well,
That's the problem I have.
It's like those songs that say something to the point of, look what you made God do. He had to go to the cross. How can you not love him given what he's done for you? And that's true, but there's such a tinge of shame to it.
Right.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Some of that theology.
Yeah, and I think one of the best quotes out of Luther's commentary is this: under the papacy, under the popes, under the papacy, we were told to toil until the feeling of guilt had left us. But the authors of this deranged idea were frequently driven to despair.
Yeah.
That is really strong language for that we're really righteous. Not that we're not righteous, but somehow God thinks we are because he's a little clueless. It's nothing like that. Again, I'll read that. Under the papacy, we were told to toil until the feeling of guilt had left us. But the authors of this deranged idea were frequently driven to despair. Well, by this time, clearly, Luther had already decided that the Pope was the Antichrist, so he wasn't going to say anything really good about him anyways. But I think the point is well taken. We can't toil ourselves into getting rid of our guilt, and that's the point. Okay, anything else?
Why did you put in the sight of God on your whiteboard?
I put this here to show this is what Calvin said in his commentary, and I'm trying to say that it's not right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, now we're going to hit verse 9, and we're going to take a totally different direction. Verse 9, so then, those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham the believer. Now, what I want to do is, first I want you to notice again, Why does he use the word blessed here? Why is this word blessed so important?
Blessed with the gift of faith. Yeah, what Abraham got, the righteousness.
12:3.
That's right. Genesis 12:3. And in you all the families on the earth will be blessed. And he's referencing back. He's just pounding this message home. Okay, Galatians 3. Okay, now verse 9, and then we're gonna stop at verse 9, and we're gonna take a little different direction. Verse 9. So then, those who are of faith are blessed. There's that word again, with Abraham, the believer. Now, I happen to I'm going to go to the King James Version on this for a second. It's said a little different and, in my opinion, a little more clearly. So then, they which be of faith are blessed, there's the word again, with faithful Abraham. In other words, the man of faith. Here are blessed because of faith. It's not we're blessed because of the workful Abraham, but instead the faithful Abraham. And I think that is a very interesting way of looking at this. And let me read you one more thing. The Jews exhibited a working Abraham. The Pope exhibits a working Christ, or an exemplary Christ. See, this is really, really cool when you start connecting the dots on all this stuff, because you start understanding. See, the Catholics do not have a justification by faith mentality. They are justification by faith and works. It's yes, you have to believe, but yes, it's also sacraments in the church. It's a combination of works and faith. So in light of that, listen to this. The Pope, and that's still current today, guys. This isn't like, oh, but the Pope in the 1500s. This is the same theology that the Catholics have today. The Pope exhibits a working Christ, or an exemplary Christ. The Pope quotes Christ saying, recorded in John 13:15, quote, I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Protestants do not deny that Christians ought to imitate the example of Christ, but mere imitation will not satisfy God. Mere imitation of Christ will not satisfy God. And bear in mind that Paul is not discussing the example of Christ in these verses. He's talking about the salvation of Christ. So you're going to see that this exemplary theory that's going on here is something that's happened throughout from the Jews and from the Catholics, saying, no, this is about us following Jesus' example. That's what makes us good enough. Because Jesus says in John 13:15, I give you my example, you should do what I do. And of course, as Protestants, we say, no, that is not a salvation verse. These are salvation verses. Okay, so there you have it. Those are those 4 verses. But here's where I want to spend the rest of the time. We talked about verse 6. Even so, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. But every one of us needs to be able to know, especially if you're part of the Lives Transforming family, every one of us needs to know, what are we going to do with this verse? In fact, what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to bring up 2 separate screens. Can you see both of these? Somebody say yes?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm going to unsync these, and I'm going to take us to James chapter 2. We're not going to read the Message. We're going to read the New American Standard. One second. All right, check this verse out. Right here. And also, check this verse out. So here on the left-hand side in Galatians 3:6, it says God would justify Gentiles by faith. James says this, you see that man is justified by works and not by faith alone. What in the world are you going to do with this? Now here is what's fun about this verse. Incredibly fun. Look at what James refers to when he's making his argument. The same exact verse, Genesis 15:6, that Paul uses over here. Okay, this, if you don't know how to discuss what's the connection between these two, or if you haven't come to terms with it, you are going to get ate up. And the reason I know this is because I have been eaten up by this verse before, by some people that didn't particularly like me very much. So here we go. We're going to talk about these verses the rest of the time. Let me get to this, to my spots. Do you see how... Now, we're not talking about... notice how we're not talking about just a little bit of discrepancy, are we? It looks like it's saying the opposite thing. Do you agree with me?
Yes.
And these are the kind of verses that liberal Protestants want to use to suggest the Bible is errant. Well, the Bible has so many discrepancies, can't possibly be true. Now, first of all, we already know the background here. And the background is that James is clearly speaking to a Jewish audience, and Paul is speaking to a Gentile audience, and so you can understand that it's going to be slanted. However, it's way more than that, and it's more interesting than that, in my opinion. Right. So, first of all, I don't know if, Cheryl, you have your Ryrie study Bible or not.
I do.
Yeah, Ryrie does a great job. First of all, Ryrie does a great job. Ryrie suggests, he says this. Let me get this over here so I'm not totally out of the picture. In Paul's writings, to justify means to declare a sinner righteous. Now, to declare a sinner righteous is this transfusion that we've been talking about. The faith makes you righteous. However, in James, it means to show to be righteous. This is a very big difference. So let's pull my board up. Got too many things going on here. So in Paul, he is suggesting faith declares you righteous. James shows you to be righteous. This is very, very important. Now,
and why does he say vindicate? That doesn't seem to jibe.
he is using the word to vindicate as he's using the term vindicate to mean to prove, to show.
Okay. Oh,
All right.
I get it. I get it. Okay.
All right.
To other people.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to go to one other section here. The Dallas theologian guys also do a pretty good job of explaining this. I really like what Ryrie says here. The question is often held to be directly opposed to Paul's statement that Abraham's faith, not his work, caused God to declare him righteous. Paul, however, was arguing for the priority of faith, and James was arguing for the proof of faith. So this is the priority of faith, and this, James, is arguing for the proof of faith. Okay? Now we're going to show this here in a second visually. James explained that Abraham's faith was evident in his practice of Isaac's sacrifice. All right, so let's go over here to James real quick. As you will see in verse 21, he uses an argument that says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? But I want you to think about this argument as James saying, didn't Abraham's offering of Isaac his son on the altar, didn't that prove that he was righteous? Didn't that obedience prove that he was righteous? How could he have possibly done that if he didn't have faith? Didn't that prove that he had faith? Okay? Do you see the difference between making someone righteous and showing that the extension of righteousness? So one of the things, another thing that the Dallas guys say is, works serve as a barometer of the justification, while faith is the basis for the justification. Faith is the force behind the deed is the finality of the faith. All right, now this is not new to us here, because if you remember, Jesus already has explained all this to us. And we've talked about it forever. Luke 6:43 to 48 says, here is the tree. Here's the roots of the tree. And here's the tree. And here's the leaves. And here's the apples, the fruit on the tree. So we'll go back to Luke chapter 6:43. Okay. And for there is no good tree which produces bad fruit, nor on the other hand a bad tree that produces bad fruit, for each tree is known by its fruit. Let's look at the Message. So I love the way Eugene Peterson explains this. You don't get wormy apples off a healthy tree or diseased apple off a diseased tree. The health of the apple tells the health of the tree. You must begin with your own life-giving lives. It's who you are, not what you say and do that counts, because your true being brims over into true words and deeds. This is exactly what James is saying. It's exactly what Paul is saying. Whoops, sorry about that. Whatever I did, I didn't mean to do it. Okay. So, the origination of our righteousness comes by faith. But of course, this is going to naturally lead to good fruit. How many times have we talked about the fact that our thoughts and our emotions are our roots and our actions are the fruit? Paul and James are saying the exact same thing. Paul is saying our faith is what declares us righteous. And out of that righteousness, our actions will come. James is saying these actions prove what? That we have faith. There is no better proof than Abraham putting Isaac on the altar, ready to kill him, of faith. You would have to have some pretty significant faith to do that, don't you think? In other words, who could in their right mind say, Abraham put Isaac on the altar, but he didn't really believe in God? That would be the most ludicrous statement in the universe. And what James is saying is just that. Abraham obviously had faith. And it's proven, it's proof that he had faith, because look at what he's done. Now, do these actions save us? Do works save us? Absolutely not. This is salvation. This righteousness, though, that we get transfused into us is what gives us the power to act, and these actions are proof of the righteousness, the power of God in us. Okay, so now let's...
That's fabulous. Derek, one question just to clear this up for me. Don't your Dallas guys also say that we're only declared righteous, that we aren't infused or transfused with the actual righteousness of Christ? Don't they just talk about declaration of it?
You know, I haven't read everything here. They do mention that we are declared righteous. To me, I can't see a difference between transfused, imputed, and declared. If God declares me something, then that makes it so. That's how I look at that. I don't look at it like, I don't understand the word declared righteous as you're declared something, but you're not really it.
I had a pastor, a Dallas theological pastor, argue vehemently that we were not righteous. Our being was not righteous. We were just declared righteous.
Yeah. This is not the language by these. This particular commentary is written by the Dallas Theological Seminary, I guess, whatever you call it, group of teachers, in particular Wolford and Zook. Let me continue on and read what they say because it's pretty strong. Faith is the force behind the deed. The deed is the finality of the faith. The verb translated was made complete means to carry to the end. And he's talking about James chapter 22 through 24. Was made complete is the phrase used in the NIV. Means to carry to the end. Faith finds fulfillment in action. Well, this is exactly what we're saying right here. Jeez, I keep doing that. This is exactly what we're saying right here. Faith is naturally going to find its fulfillment in its action. James and Paul quoted the same passage, Genesis 15:6. Paul said that Abraham was justified by faith, and James said that Abraham was justified by faith evidenced by what he did. That's what is given by the Dallas guys, and it seems to line up very well with what Ryrie's saying. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't somebody from... See, here's the thing. If you've got somebody from Dallas who has a Calvinistic slant, they may try to intellectually separate a declaration of righteousness with real righteousness. You see how Calvin did that earlier? Well, you're righteous in the sight of God.
Yes, right.
Okay. I don't believe... I personally do not believe that God... I think intellectually you have to conclude that God is somehow not in his right mind to suggest that you are something, but you're really not. That's how I view it. Now, not everybody's going to view it that way. More legalistic people, and frankly, Calvin was very legalistic, is certainly going to suggest that, no, maybe God really says you are, but you aren't really. That is, and from my perspective, it's because we really haven't grasped the idea that righteousness leads to obedience every time. If we truly understand we're righteous, the obedience is going to follow. The power of righteousness gives us the power to obey. Unfortunately, our humanism, and even evangelical humanism, gives us the belief sometimes that we can somehow act in obedience even if we're really not righteous. That, to me, is kind of an abomination of what Paul's talking about here. Okay, where are we at here? One more verse I'll show you, and then we'll... Oops, let's get over here. Oh, let's just review this James passage, and then we'll look at one more verse, and then we'll be done. Verse 20. But are you willing to recognize that faith without works is useless? Another thing that's important here is that it has been told or suggested by some that James is really also fighting against libertines. And libertines are not people who are extending imputed righteousness in their living. Libertines are people who are attempting to justify sin for the purpose of justifying sin, not to justify themselves. Okay? They're trying to concoct ways of believing. See, nobody with this belief system right here is going to get up in the morning and say, having sex with the chapel prostitute really is a good thing. Nobody in their right mind is going to say that. Oh, we're going to have sex with the temple prostitute today. But if you really wanted to have sex with the temple prostitute, and you're trying to convince yourself that it's a good thing to have sex with the temple prostitute, then you might suggest that, well, I believe in God, so I can go have sex with a temple prostitute. But that wouldn't make any sense at all. Because you wouldn't be acting out of your righteousness. You would be acting out of a deception that somehow having sex with a temple prostitute is a good thing. You see what I'm suggesting? This is this is also who James is fighting against. These people were called libertines. It wasn't that they were abusing grace. They were trying to make excuses to having sex with the temple prostitute. There's a big difference. 22. You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. Well, I have no problem with that. As you can see, this is what creates salvation. This is what's imputed into you. And when it acts out into good fruit, the word perfected can be a little confusing, but I would suggest that to the extent it's manifested out into the world, that if perfected means effective, then that makes sense. It becomes very effective. Our righteousness becomes effective with other people as it extends actions out into the world. You see that faith was working with his works, and the result of the works was faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Isn't it interesting? The scripture was fulfilled? Yes. This is the righteousness. And that righteousness is ultimately effective. It's fulfilled ultimately into the actions, the good fruit that's going to come out of that righteousness. Okay? Thus, the way you would read this verse would be, you see that man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Would be rather stated, you see that man, it is, you see that the works of man shows that he has faith. Would be, it proves, these works prove that he has faith. And so what James is saying is that it is a combination. And it is. The problem is, humanism, legalism, starts up here. Grace starts right here. And the guys from Dallas really, really get this right when they say, Paul is arguing for the priority of faith. James argues for the proof of faith. Priority means this comes first, and then this comes second. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. I hope this has been beneficial. These kind of things are just extraordinarily interesting to me, but we do have about 5 minutes left. I'd love to have any questions you might have or comments or feedback. Did you like this kind of thing? Did you not? Would you rather just stick to the main verses? Tell me what you're thinking, guys.
I love this kind of stuff. The deeper, the better. I love that, and I need support for my own explanation, my own understanding, and then explanation. So to me, it was wonderful.
Yeah, I'm with Cheryl on that.
Who just said that?
That was me. Sorry, I haven't been talking. I've been.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm with Cheryl. What this really does, again, is you get the aha moments, every week. But there's that difference to be able to say to somebody what's in the foundation, what is it that makes the foundation, and what's the support behind it. And this is, again, very, very important stuff. Because again, you've got James, who Paul had been reprimanding, and Peter and everybody else because of the way they had gone. And sometimes I look at this and I'm going, was James still a little bit confused? Because again, he's coming back, with the whole Jerusalem thing, and like the Judaizers, was he mixing some things up? And that's how in the very beginning of Galatians, Paul was already reprimanding him. Sometimes I wonder if what we're seeing is a part of that process that was happening.
Yes. The risk is, of course, is that you're going to determine that you would be deceived into believing that James really is screwed up, thus the Bible must be screwed up.
Exactly. So it's not inerrant. No, I see that.
Yeah. Jeff, Peach, are you still with us?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any feedback? What are your thoughts on this evening?
I like the tie between the verses, and then, when you brought it back to the tree, it really brought it all together for me, and I think you're exactly right. It's where I've been tripped up as well when someone wants to pull out that other verse and say, well, it says right here, the works. It's like, well, yeah, but that comes out of the real faith and righteousness that is within us. We don't do these actions just because we want to prove that we have faith. We do it because it is within us.
Yeah, the be leads into the do.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what was really, you said it well when you said the legalism really starts at the top of the tree, because we always want to get people to do what they're supposed to, right?
Yep.
We don't want to be patient enough to let them gain the faith.
Yeah. Legalism starts at the top of the tree, and humanism starts at the top of the tree. Humanism meaning that, well, we're good and we're good enough. As long as we do good, then we are good. We'll be fine. So in effect, secular humanism says we don't really need a God because we can do good enough.
Hey, Lisa says she's not able to talk. She had to switch computers, you guys, in the middle of this. She says she finds this very helpful because it validates the scriptures further. And Chris comes back with, "Man, I love it, man."
Okay. With even his accent, that's very good. I'm going to unmute Kathy for a second. Kathy, are you still there?
I'm here.
What are your thoughts? Maybe some aha moments you had, or thoughts that you kind of came across as we were going through this?
I think the thing that I'm left with is the phrase that comes to mind is faith expressing itself in love, or faith working itself out in love. And that makes more sense to me because I always trip over the works part.
Yeah.
Or if I don't have the works, I don't have faith. But faith expresses itself in the works of love, and that's, of course, normal. And I like the priority in the proof. That makes sense. One comes first and the other flows from that.
Yeah, that's very good. And I think the important thing there is that we don't see the natural tendency. What Kathy was saying is, here's what people do that just is crushing. Oh, so if they're not acting the way I want them to act, then their faith must be screwed up. That's the most horrific deception that I think can be displayed. Look, the be comes before the do, and when we start trying to judge somebody's insides based on what they're doing, we have just taken the place of God and totally, in my opinion, just totally messed up our part and God's part. And that is danger zone when it comes to judgment. Steve, are you still with us?
Still here. I love the tree explanation. I was thinking how, if I'm thinking this through properly, my addiction to works, all the things that I would want to do, read my Bible more, pray more, go to church, stand on my head, whatever it is, I keep doing all these things, and I'm totally missing the source of it all, the root, which is righteousness. And when I start to think of those things and how that's been important to me, and it's a blessing that goes all the way back to way back. It's exciting because now the things that I do is a reflection of that righteousness. It's let me use the word proof. To me, here's an example. This is the fruit in my life. Am I thinking it through the way you described it with that tree illustration?
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that God knows in His infinite wisdom that when we really understand that we're already righteous and we're already okay, then out of that we naturally have the desire to move towards the Bible reading. If we start up here and we say to ourselves, we're bad and we need to read, and we need to have the duty of reading, you can see very quickly how we're going to resent God, just like Luther resented God. Luther hated God because he was righteous. Luther states he hated God because he was righteous. Why? Because he could never live up, and he hated never living up, and he hated never living up to a righteous God who then would punish him. But if we are already righteous, now our actions are from pure motives, not out of motives of duty, not out of motives that I'm going to somehow like check off my list, this godly thing I got to do for this doggone God that's making me crazy. See the difference?
Yeah.
All right.
That kicks butt because that takes the pressure right off.
Yeah. And the fact is, God doesn't want you. I mean, imagine, I've told this story before and we got to end in about 30 seconds, but my wife doesn't want me bringing her flowers home out of duty. And God is not interested in us doing stuff for him out of duty. My wife wants me to bring flowers home because I love her, because I care for her, because I want to, not because I have to. Can you imagine? God is smart enough to know that us bringing him flowers out of duty is not really loving him. It's not really loving him. Now, the irony is, the only way we can love him is if we are already righteous. And the only way we're already righteous is if he gives it to us. So he is the source of everything that we can give back to these actions, which is absolutely crucial. Okay. Anybody else have anything else to add?
Just that down here in Florida next year, they wanted to do, a few gals wanted to do the book of James, and I've always been afraid of it because I didn't understand it. And this helps tremendously for me to know how to approach it should we embark.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, we're going to stop right here. I'm going to exit out. We'll get ready for the next webinar. Those of you that are getting ready for that, you'll have to click on the other link that you got in your email.
Lisa said to tell Cheryl that she says bye. And she also says that she wants flowers out of duty, love, lust, sucking activity, faith.
Yeah, so just make a note that Lisa doesn't care what the actual motive is as long as she gets the flowers.
And Chris says that he once brought her home some duty.
All right, we won't go there.
Thanks, Derek.
Okay, guys, have a good
Well done,
week.
brother.
I'll see some of you in a few minutes, and I'll talk to you later. I'm